Hey, thank you for having me. I'm a little sad I don't get to be up in Chicago for this one, especially after all this talk of pizza and everything. I greatly enjoy being in Florida. Maybe not so much on the quality of pizza side, though, when it comes to that in Florida. So a little envious of not being able to be up there this year. But again, thank you all for having me. In this session, we're going to be talking about how to take the power of the DSC engine, and don't worry if you have no idea what that is. We're going to go through it and how to basically, harness all that power and manage our vSphere, our VMware vSphere environments using the greatness that is PowerCLI. So a little bit about me. Bonnie gave a great run through, but I do want to leave some contact information with everybody as well. Again, my name is Kyle Ruddy. I do technical marketing currently for HashiCorp, where I cover Terraform. Outside of that, love speaking at events like this, doing community things, sharing all the information that I've been able to gather over my time and career. So check out stuff like my blog. Everything is pretty much KM Ruddy for username. So whether it's blog, GitHub, Twitter, all kinds of things, it's out there generally under that username. So feel free to reach out and connect. All right, so brief agenda, because we're trying to stay on time here. I don't want to disrupt that anymore, especially now that we're back on time. So we're going to be talking about what configuration management is and how that can really be applied to our infrastructures, and really, how that gives us some additional value. Then, we're at a PowerShell conference, so maybe I won't talk about what is PowerShell too much, but then we're diving into what is PowerCLI, what does DSC do, and how do we tie PowerCLI together with DSC to really make some magic. Then there at the end, I've got some really cool demos that we're going to run through. All right, so first and foremost, configuration management. This is something that's defined out there on Wikipedia as a systems engineering process for establishing and maintaining consistency of a product's performance, functional, and physical attributes. So basically that means that, you're able to deploy something and maintain that it stays that same way throughout the entire life cycle. Yeah, very cool. Some of the benefits here that configuration kind of brings to the table here is that it's declarative, meaning that instead of, the imperative way that we all write our PowerShell scripts today, instead with this, we declare what we want the end result to be. And that back-end engine, whatever it may be, is going to go through all the processes to make that happen. It's also idempotent. So no matter how many times we run our declarative process, we end up with the exact same thing. So nothing changes. You're not going to end up with like 15 different virtual machines depending upon how many times you run this. It also is nice because it unifies the configuration process across the board. So, this session is about VMware vSphere, whereas, this is also applicable to things outside of that, such as networking and storage and pretty much, anything. And it also allows teams to follow a little bit of conformance. So basically being able to, if one person is skilled or knowledgeable in a certain area of configuration management, they can generally take those skills and apply them throughout the environment, so that it's not just, because you know stuff about DSC with vSphere doesn't mean that doesn't translate into using DSC otherwise in the environment. So here's a really quick breakdown of just generalization and visualization of how this works. So off to our right-hand side here, we have a node. We're in a VMware session, vSphere, so we're going to use a virtual machine. So this virtual machine, we want to configure that. So we have this configuration document. So this is going to be a file that's human readable, meaning there's some form of text that's in there that we can modify depending upon what we want that VM to look like. Then we have our central server, or our point of control. And this is going to be what houses a repository. And that repository, actually I should take a step back here. Our central server, our point of control, that holds onto those configurations, this is also going to be what applies those configurations. So it kind of manages how those things are done. So then we I briefly already talked about the repository. Our configurations are going to live in a repository. I'm a huge fan of source control, so hopefully you have some sort of Git-based or whatever version control that you're using in your environment. Please use it with these configuration management definitions. Then that repository is going to be able to be accessible somehow by our central server. From that point, there's going to be some sort of connection that's established between the two of them, depending upon which configuration management solution that you're using. And from that point, we're going to ship over our configuration, that document that we wrote up. And then from there, it's going to start creating some of these policies or processes or even applications that are being installed. We can do things like firewall rules and DNS, or even getting a little more granular and advanced and start doing different application level things, like maybe setting up a database or setting up multiple tier applications. Then at that point, the connection is severed and it's going to go on for this process. And the central server is going to keep connecting back to that virtual machine, that node, and checking, has anything changed? Do we need to do anything? Are remediations necessary? And you can even get a little crazy and have it set up to do auto remediations, meaning that if anybody makes a change to that virtual machine, our central server can go back, connect, make those changes back to the way that we have defined them as. So really cool from that aspect. All right, so there's a ton of different options that are out there on the configuration management landscape. Things like Ansible and Chef, Puppet, SaltStack, and DSC, PowerShell DSC, I should say. Here's a brief run through of kind of like how these all break down, because each one of them have their own different pieces of information and intricacies and terminologies. So for the most part, our Ansible, although Ansible can be used in several different languages, when it comes to the VMware side, Ansible's backend is written in Python. Same can be said for SaltStack. Chef and Puppet going to be Ruby based essentially. PowerShell DSC, obviously it's going to be PowerShell. On the infrastructure side, we all have different levels of our central server, that point of control. Like Chef has a workstation. Puppet uses a Puppet master. So does SaltStack. They have a Salt master. The central point of control is the next level down. Ansible uses Tower. That's going to be their enterprise grade version of that. On the DSC side, I believe the pull server is still out there and available, as well as being able to use Azure Automation to help do that. Scripting and terminology gets into its own different lingo. Chef is kind of fun because it uses recipes and cookbooks. It's humorous play off of their name. And then lastly, this is a big one, task execution order. A majority of these are going to be sequential, meaning that if you put one rule or define one rule first, it's always going to be ran or checked for first. Puppet's the only outlier to that. It can be ran non-sequentially, but it just depends on how you write it. So let's check out a quick Ansible example here before we dive into the DSC side of things. So this is what it looks like to set an NTP server for an ESXi host using some of the VMware resources that Ansible has. Our top level up there, we're just defining a name for what this configuration is going to do. Name it something that you understand. Then we're using the VMware host NTP resource to then connect to that host and do some things. We can see how we connect to it through our credentials, such as host name, username, password. Then we get to cluster name. So in this case, we're actually assigning NTP servers to all the hosts that are in a specific cluster. So be aware of that. There are some properties that kind of streamline this whole process and make it easier. And then finally, we get down to the point of state and the NTP server. So we're just saying, hey, we want this to be present, meaning we want only these NTP servers to exist. And we're using some pool.ntp.orgs. Here's a little different way. So if you don't have those pre-created resources out there and available, there's also things like the URI module. In this case, our URI module is doing two different tasks that we can see here. Our top one, which hopefully we can all see across the URL line, it's going out and creating our API session to our vCenter server. This is creating a post. You can see username, password. Of course, do not do that in your own environments. This is just for the sake of this demonstration. In your own environments, use some sort of vault mechanism to protect your credentials and other protected information. Then down here at the bottom, at the time, an SSH module didn't exist for these hosts. So instead, we can reach out to our VCSA. It's then the API call is then to access, and then SSH. We're doing another put, and we're looking for a specific SSH auth .json, which builds out the body for how the API is looking for a request in order to manage the SSH service for that particular vCenter server. Okay, kind of a generalization, went kind of fast. Don't worry, I'll be hanging out. We can, if anybody has questions, we can handle that. I'm going to scream through this section of it because hopefully everybody knows that by this point that PowerShell is a task automation and newly configuration management framework. This is all from Microsoft. It's been doing crazy things that was originally, or still continues to be based on the .NET framework. However, now includes such things as .NET Core once you get into PowerShell 6 and 7. So basically, straightforward path to automation, really easy verb noun context. If you've used it with VMware, get VM. What's that do? It gets you information about a virtual machine. It's modular, it's object oriented. All of these things help, especially when it gets over to our DSC section that we'll be talking about here shortly, because that means it's just so much easier to move this about within your environment. There's nothing to install. You just make sure that you have some modules that are there, and boom, you're ready to go. Okay, so PowerCLI. This is really cool. This is VMware's command line and scripting tool that's built on top of Windows PowerShell. So this is just a set of modules. Last I looked this morning on the PowerShell gallery, I think there's 26 different resources that are assigned to VMware's organization. I believe 23 or 24 of those are actually dedicated to the package collection that is PowerCLI. And what this does is it gives you 800 different commandlets for managing pretty much every aspect of the VMware stack. So if you want to manage Virtual Center, ESXi, other things such as vRealize Operations, vCloud Director, Horizon View, all of these things are now available for you to interact with PowerCLI. But I should also throw out, like, if there aren't commandlets to do something, PowerCLI can also access some of those API levels as well. So you can kind of build your own functions or modules to fill in gaps that maybe PowerCLI hasn't covered already. And it has been regarded as one of the most robust and complete PowerShell deployments in the world, which is super cool, extremely cool. Probably one of the reasons why PowerCLI was able to be on that release of PowerShell Core 6. All right, so let's talk about PowerShell DSC and the engine there. So here's a brief breakout or layout of how DSC works in terms of your infrastructure. So we have our user over here to the left-hand side. We then have our user configuration. This configuration is going to be created in PowerShell. So it's literally a .ps1 file. So everything internal to that is written in PowerShell. You can use PowerShell logic, variables, all of those things that we already know and love to use this with the DSC engine for configuration management purposes. From that point, we take our user configuration and compile that, which turns this configuration into MOF files, manage object format files. And each node that's being managed by DSC is going to get their own MOF file. That's what's happening in the screenshot here. So node 1 has their own MOF, node 2 has their own MOF. And from that point, these are sent out to those nodes where there is a service that's living on top of them called the LCM, or Local Configuration Management Service. That service is going to take that MOF file, run through all of it, and be able to interpret what the end state is and how to go from where that system currently lives to where it should be. Oh, there we go. Here's a sample configuration file. So the layout here, line 1, configuration is just telling it that the name of this configuration is my DSC configuration. From there, we can specify some of our nodes, which is where where our configuration should be applied to. In this case, we're specifying 2 different nodes. So, you can build on top of this. You don't have to just specify one node and then create a configuration. You can declare this out for as many nodes as you want. From that point, we're installing or making sure that there are 2 different Windows features that are present. We can see on line 4 and line 9 that we're using the Windows feature resource in order to create these things for our RSAT or our remote administrative tools, as well as BitLocker, making sure that both of those are installed and present. And then bottom is our calling out our MyDSC configuration, which is the compilation and basically turning this configuration into that MOF file that I was referring to. All right, so let's talk about DSC and the resources that are there for VMware itself. So this was something that was introduced back in late 2018. I consider this kind of like a Christmas present because this is something that I've been super eager for. vCommunity rockstar Luke Deakins has his own version of some DSC resources that have been really exciting to be using. And so I was thrilled that VMware kind of jumped on board and started to create their own resources for consumption. So this is basically just taking that DSC engine that we talked about, mixing it with PowerCLI, and doing some really cool stuff. The other super neat thing, this is out there and it's open sourced on GitHub, so anybody can make use of it. This is also the first thing from PowerCLI that has been open sourced. So tremendous step forward there. If you're interested in contributing back, definitely hit up that GitHub repo and either submit issues of what you'd like to see, or even submit your own PR or pull requests. A couple dependencies. So when this was written and created, it does still have a requirement on Windows PowerShell. So 5.1 is a requirement. Still need to have PowerCLI 10.1.1 or newer. As of today, PowerShell or PowerCLI 12 has been released. You also need to be able to run PowerShell as an administrator, and you need to make sure that both the PowerCLI modules and the DSC resources for VMware are accessible for all users' access, because DSC is going to run behind the scenes as a service account, essentially. So if you've been following and you just heard what I was talking about there, you probably noticed something that might actually be a problem. Because we're using PowerShell 5.1, well, vCSAs have been transitioning to Linux appliances, or, Photon appliances, rather, I should say, that are Linux-based. ESXi has been running its own version that looks vaguely similar to a Linux, but it's definitely not Windows. So, how do we go from our configuration file over to what we want to manage? So in this case, we've introduced what's known as an LCM proxy. So this LCM proxy is going to be your Windows system. So this is where the configuration file is going to, or rather the MOF is going to be sent to. This is where LCM is going to run, and LCM is going to, from that point, connect out to the resources that you want to manage. So when I said those dependencies that are there, like Windows PowerShell 5.1 and PowerCLI 10.1.1 or better, the LCM proxy is where those resources should live. All right, so here's a sample configuration. It looks very similar to the other Windows configuration for configuring those Windows features. However, key points here, line number 2 right there, that's where we import our DSC resources, making those vSphere DSC resources available for everybody to start making use of. From that point, we have some creation of our credential file, because every single one of these resources are going to reach out and authenticate to our vCenter server. And then at the bottom, that's where our compilation is going to happen to create our MOF file. Here, it's very similar to our Ansible resource, where we're doing some NTP configuration against a host. Actually, the one thing that I also want to call out as I'm going through here, line 9 and line 10. So line 9 is name, line 10 is server. So if you've used PowerCLI, the name is, think of that as the name of the system that you want to modify or apply this configuration to. Now, this would be our host name. Server is going to be that thing that we're connecting PowerCLI to. So, those can be the same, those can be separate, just depending upon how you want to make use of this. The other thing that I didn't call out earlier, if you've noticed with this example, we're connecting to an ESXi server. So that means that there's no licensing restrictions. So like this isn't something that you would need a higher level of licensing for. Now, I will throw out the caveat, the basic ESXi licenses are probably not going to work because this is connecting to the API on the back end, so you at least need that bare minimum license. But if you have like a vCenter server license, you're all set. Okay, so what can we do with these resources before I jump into some demos? So we can do things at the vCenter level. We can configure message of the day. We can create data center and cluster resources. We can do things with ESXi hosts like that NTP configuration or DNS, creating syslog, even standard switching. And then lastly, the one that I think is kind of cool is also, we can apply PowerCLI settings. Like with version, I believe it was 12, when it came out, it had a change in the way that our certificates or, the on-premises certificates were handled, meaning that if you had a self-signed certificate, instead of being a ignored error, it would error out and be hard stop. So now you can use something like DSC to say that all of our PowerCLI configurations should ignore that error. So kind of cool from that aspect. There are some things on the roadmap here, such as HA and DRS for our cluster resources, even some more things for standard switches and even more things for VM hosts that are on the roadmap. Check out the GitHub repo for more information about that. And let's get into demos. All right, so this is my demo environment. This is just a Windows 2016 box with some stuff already installed. I've already pre-created a DSC resource to run. In this case, we're specifying out our vCenter server, which is just this one right here. We're using a service account called DSC service. Again, don't put your passwords in your configuration. Use a vault, use something along those lines. I'm only doing this just for the purposes of this demonstration to make it simple. Then we have some folder structures that we're going to create and a VM host that maybe we'll want to interact with. From that point, we go down to our configuration. We are calling this our vCenter config. We have our import of our DSC resource, and then we dive right into doing things like configuring some vCenter statistics, telling it to change our period to day, our period length to 3, our level to 2, all of these things that maybe will put less stress on our vCenter server when it comes to logging and maintaining those statistics. Below that, we're going to create a new data center that's called PSConf Chicago, because that's where we're presenting right now. Then we're going to create a cluster. This cluster is going to be named PSConf Chicago cluster. Then down here at the bottom of this line, we have a depends on. This is important because this says that we cannot, do not try and create this cluster unless that data center object called PSConf Chicago exists. So it kind of, keeps your code tight. Make sure that things don't get too far out of line. Then from there, we're going to use a for each loop to take a look at that list of folders that we created above for prod demo or prod demo and or development and management. So we're going to run through each one of those, creating the folders. Then each one of those folders are going to have a nested folder, rather called windows. Again, we're able to use variable specification to still maintain our depends on, so that nothing gets too far out of whack. Then lastly, we create a VMware folder. Then down here at the bottom, we're doing some crazy stuff for our host that I've already talked about, including creating a standard switch that's called VSS_PSConf Chicago. So, this whole thing is lined up. I'll share this out there on my GitHub repo here shortly after this, but I want to run through to this. I may not have compiled this. That is a oops on my part, so apologies for that, but it runs fairly quickly. So here we've compiled it, we've created our moth file. If we look at our file structure here, we can see that we have a vCenter config folder that's new that includes our localhost.moth. So let me clear that. We will do our start DSC configuration path. We will do that to our vCenter config. We're going to do a wait. Oh, actually, we're going to do a force and a wait, which I will talk about here in just a second. Okay, so this is just running our, taking that configuration file, or rather that moth file, telling DSC that's where it lives, that's what we want to apply, and then we are using the force parameter to say apply this now, and we're using the wait so that it waits in our terminal session and says, hey, we want to see the output from this. So if we jump over to our vCenter environment, it looked like it already ran through creating some of the things and doing some preparation there. Now we can see PSConf Chicago was created, PSConf Chicago cluster was created, and we can start seeing that as soon as this loads, we were even able to create things like DRS and turn that on, make that accessible. If we expand out our DSConf Chicago, we can start seeing some of our file structures being created. So we have our management folder, we have our Linux and Windows nested folders. We can see the same thing here for production, and then it's going to finish up at the end by taking a look at our, by adding the VMware folder. Then it's also going to take a look at and doing the host configuration as well. I think I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to let this just rip, and I'll show you the video of the other thing that I kind of want to show. That's the pre-recorded demo. So I have one more thing. So you may have noticed this morning when hopefully you listened to Jeffrey Snover's keynote when he had some discussions about DSC and how all that exactly works. Now, I want to throw out that DSC is a platform interface. And basically what I mean by that, this is kind of a hot take. For several years amongst the PowerShell community, everybody was like, no, DSC is the end result. Like, that is how you do those things. Even though I understand what I just showed you was all through DSC. But really, DSC is just the engine behind the usage of other configuration management technologies, meaning that, you can use things like Ansible, you can use things like Puppet, Salt. All of these pieces have connections and resources that operate and work with DSC. So, that means if you want to write everything in PowerShell, that's cool. If you want to write your resources in Ansible, but maybe they don't have the resources that are available that are out there and exist for PowerShell, you can use Ansible to talk to DSC and still maintain that that level of consistency and reliability within your environment. So I'm going to run through. Apologies, I would love to run through this as a live demo, but we're going to do a host configuration piece right here. So what I'm showing is we're getting back some information about SSH for a set of hosts. So this is ESX01 through 4. We can see that we're looking at SSH and the policy is currently off. Now we're going to jump over to Ansible, where I'll show you the output for one of the playbooks that are out there that's within Ansible. So here's where the power of DSC can really come into play for those environments already using Ansible. We're using the WinDSC resource that's right here to go through and define all of these things. And then we're even using some Ansible logic to loop through and apply that configuration to the SSH service to those 4 different servers. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Ansible, we're just running basically a command that says, hey, Ansible, take a look at this YAML file that contains that configuration that I was just showing everybody and apply it. So what's happening right now is it's gathering facts. And if you'll notice right here, it's reaching out to our DSCM server. That's still our DSC proxy system. That's where, you know, Windows PowerShell is. That's where PowerCLI is. So it's still talking to all those resources, still has that dependency. And then you could see at the bottom, there were some changes that were applied. Then if we come back to our PowerShell session here, we rerun our command, we can see that now all of our hosts have changed from having a policy of off and running of false to now our policy is on and our running status is true. So really cool aspect, really cool usage of being able to combine, you know, things that you might already have in your environment with the power and accessibility of DSC. So if you've seen anything today that you're really excited about and maybe missing from the DSC resources for VMware and vSphere, head out to the GitHub repository, open up a comment. You're more than welcome to do that. And I will finish up here with a link to our GitHub repository, link to my Twitter account, and then check out VMware Code. There's a Slack channel and a bunch of really cool stuff out there that, especially a really giant PowerCLI community. There's over 1,000 members in that channel, so really cool.